be filming this. So I'm going to go through a quick presentation. Well, I'm going to try to go through this and give you some information on a lot of different things. First, I always start out, we have a school board, and we have a couple school board members here. Just walking in, Christy and John right here, and I think those are the only two that I see in the room. There's the ones that are elected. They help give us the guidance in terms of where we're going in the district. When I first got here, I showed this slide, and I said, I think these are things that are important for any school district. I'm not going to read them to you, but they're pretty basic. On the far right, the two on the right, we've changed this slide a little bit, and we've combined those. We've combined those into the bottom, like a foundation of what we'll call fiscal responsibility. But if you look at the top four things up there, those are still the four things that we believe and that we want to work towards. I will talk about all five of these quickly at some point. Is that okay? So how many of you have seen a State of the District before? Okay. So you know that when I first got here, I started with George Clooney. And I said, that's what the district looked like to me, really good academically, good in co-curriculars, with a little budget problem on the right hand. Okay? Then the next year, budget actually started working a little better for us. We still look pretty good. George still looks pretty good. But now his left hand was having a little less problems, but a little budget issue. And last year, things were starting to come really nice, and I said, we are going to retire George. And so I promised we would retire George. So George is gone. Not. Unfortunately, the Texas legislature worked for about 8 months, and I decided I needed to bring George back. Okay? So I'm not going to tell you what George is going to look like at the beginning of this presentation, because George has many faces. Okay? But as I go through this, you're going to see many faces of George. And that is really what this whole thing is going to be about today. So, in the many faces of George, first of all, this presentation is in 3 parts. Okay? The first part is really just things you should know about the district, what we do well. The second part is probably by far the longest. And the third part is a little bit of what we've talked to the teachers about at convocation, what we see coming ahead, and what we think is important for the kids in the academic program. Okay? So, first part. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. I'm going to go pretty fast. A lot of the accolades that Eanes ISD gets are often associated with the high school, Westlake, because that's where all the awards are usually on a national basis. It's just the way it is. That said, kids go through our system, and anything that happens that's good at Westlake is usually because of something that happened prior. You know, the kids don't just get smart when they become freshmen in high school. It doesn't happen that way. So I always want to point that out before I give you some of these statistics. That ACT 27.2 is the second highest in Westlake's history. That is a very high ACT. SAT, you can see, is also very high. You can see how we relate to the country and to the state. I'm going to go fast on this. We also have outstanding opportunities that are not necessarily in the academic domain. These are the things that keep kids connected. Band, the kids behind the camera. That keeps kids connected. That's good for our kids. We always like to look at the class of 2017. Most of this is almost identical to the class of 2016, with the one exception on the amount of money they had in scholarships. That's about a $5 million increase from last year, just in terms of the amount of scholarships our kids have received. But if you look at that, most of our kids get accepted into college. Some, for whatever reason, choose to take a year off. That's okay. It's not the end of the world if they don't all go to college immediately. Sometimes that's good for a kid's development, but they get in. EEF has been critical for us. I always like to show this. The last 2 years, EEF's contributions have gone up 20% each year, which has allowed us to really control some of our staffing. They gave us $2.5 million last year for about 50 teachers. So that's part one. I don't spend a lot of time talking about how great we are because I think a lot of us know we're really good. But I now move to the first picture of George Clooney. So George Clooney looks about our test scores and, you know, what we're giving kids and what processes we can do. And the first picture we have is George is really happy. When he sees what our kids are doing, what's going on in the district, he's got a really happy face. So we start there. So I come back, and now I'm going to go through some updates. And I'm going to bring you back to this slide, and you're going to see me go through several of the things that are listed here, okay, one by one. So the first thing I want to talk about is reasonable class sizes. Almost all of these are connected to budget at the very end. But when you look at the enrollment history of our district, for the most part, we're a slow growth district. We're not like Georgetown, we're not like even Lake Travis that are growing pretty fast. We're a slow growth district. We've had two dips along the way. One was back here a couple years ago, and then a small dip in terms of enrollment this year. In general, if you look at where we lost or gained students from just looking at last year to this year, you'll find that we went down students at the elementary level more than anywhere else. We went, and when you look at the total at the middle school, it's only about a 7-student difference. So it's really about equal. And if you look at the high school went up, but only about 18 students, so it wasn't huge. When you look at all of that, we dropped by enrollment a little bit. The other thing to pay attention on this slide, if you want to pay attention to it, are transfer students, and you can look at it by level. They're pretty even for the most part, except for the high school where we went from 219 and we lowered the number of transfers to 194. That was a long discussion in the fall. We could have had 220. We very well could have had 220. I could probably have 250 if I wanted them. But we really put a cap on that at right around low 190s is where we put the cap. So that's why we're at that number. The other thing I want to show you is average class sizes, and this is just looking at 2 years. Elementary, K4, we had a little dip when you look at it. I'll tell you our 5th grades at a couple of our buildings are a little higher than I would like them to be. It was a staffing issue, and we just were really watching, and the numbers came up at the end. Middle school and high school, I think when it balances out, will be a little higher in most of the areas. Not all of the areas, but they will be a little higher in most of the areas, and that's something that we do need to keep an eye on. This is kind of a summary slide that just talks about the key things about what I basically just said in different numbers. Core classes always bother me a little bit, particularly in English, and some of the really heavy classes where there's a lot of grading and repetitive work that goes on in terms of producing papers. Those are the percentages when you look at the percentages in terms of transfers. Okay? So when George is watching the enrollment and the class size, he's doing it with his glasses on. You may not have met him yet. Jeff Arnett's one of my deputy superintendents. He watches this carefully. We also put this on the web. We're pretty transparent. We keep showing what our class sizes are at all our buildings everywhere. And I think that's something we need to keep doing. When I go ahead, the next place I want to look at is fiscal responsibility. And I'm going to come back to that because it really supports some of those other items. The goal, when we talk about this, and looking at a fund balance and a budget, there's a level of about 25% that people say, make sure you always have 3 months or 25% operating funds in the bank in case you need it. That's pretty much a standard. And part of that is our taxes come in at different points and our payroll goes out at different points. This keeps us from having to borrow to make payroll. Okay? That dips below 25% at certain times of the year, goes above at different times of the year. But that's what we think of as our floor. In a perfect world, well, let's go to some non-perfect worlds. If your expenditures are exceeding your revenue, your graph looks like that. And you are taking out of your fund balance. It's decreasing. That's not ideal. And you can't do that forever. Okay? The other possibility could be that your revenue exceeds your expenditures, and if that's the case, your graph looks like that. You're actually increasing your fund balance. What I would say is, and at a certain point, this is bad because if you are just going way, way up, you have to ask yourself some questions. Are we taxing too much? That's one question. Are we not hiring enough people? Are we not paying people what we should be paying them? You know, we got to kind of see what is the balance, what is the right step there. If I'm looking at things, and my idea of best case is that you basically have a balanced budget where the red line is just kind of running parallel to the blue line. That would be our ideal. So I want you to just kind of memorize that graph and memorize the fact that we want to stay above, if we can, 25%. Okay? That will come to play later. The other thing about fiscal responsibility is trying to maintain a tax rate that is not as burdensome on the community as possible. Our total rate is about 121. And you can see where we are with the 12 districts around us in the Central Texas area. Okay. We do have some challenges. This is a great community. It is a great community, but you have high expectations for your kids. You want the absolute best for your kids. And that sometimes is difficult based with certain budget constraints to try to deliver. That can be hard. The second thing is the Texas legislature has not updated the system, which the Supreme Court ruled constitutional, but they did say that they felt it was fundamentally flawed. And I like Dan Huberty's from the Texas House. He said they basically described it as a lawful system but an awful system. And that was their definition of it. And I'm going to tell you how this affects us, this not changing a little bit. First of all, the board did decide last year for the first time to set some legislative priorities. And you'll see one of the first ones was to please look for all the kids in Texas, look at the recapture, look at the funding, look at that. And our board members actually went to the legislature, talked to different representatives, as did many from throughout the state. But the fact, when you look at it all through it, nothing happened. They basically froze most schools in Texas funding for the next 2 years. So we are frozen in terms of the amount of new money that we will be getting. That's the first fact that you need to know. The second is there's two terms here that are important. One is tax, TAV, taxed assessed value. We have a high TAV. We have about $13 billion in property in this district. That's residential and businesses or whatever else. You look at all the property, it's about $13 billion. That's high. And that helps us. We have an M&O rate. Our M&O basically funds mostly, 86% of that is salaries and benefits for staff. The rest of it's kind of like fuel, electricity, those types of things that are just kind of ongoing consumable things that are in your system. Okay? The M&O rate is the one that really, the M&O dollars are the ones that really get hit by recapture. And I want to show you this graph. We have 101.04, and it's broken into 100 copper pennies, 4 golden. Here is our recapture rate. Last year, I wrote a check for $83 million to the state of Texas from local taxpayer money. That was 59% of our budget. This year, that'll raise to 63% of our budget that we bring in from the taxpayers to $93 million. Based on the projections that we have, that will keep going up by about $10 million a year in terms of what we're paying out. What that means is we've had this increase in property taxes because the value of property has gone up, but that hasn't increased our revenue in the same way because of the amount of recapture we're sending out. In fact, when I write the check in February is when we write the check, this will be the year that Eanes ISD goes over $1 billion that we're sending to that we have sent to the state of Texas. We'll be at $1.09 billion in recapture we have sent out thus far. Okay, that's a pretty staggering number if you think about a little district like us. We're not the biggest district. We're not like a foreign country or something. You know, we're small. So that has caused some stress. Imagine getting no new money from the state of Texas and just in the next 2 years sending out an additional $20 million out. Zero coming in, 20 million going out. That brings me to my next face of George. So George looked at that. He says, okay, 20 million going out, nothing coming in. And that was George's face. Because this is not a good thing. How'd that happen? Okay. So Remember I had talked about that a best case scenario would be something like that, right? Makes sense? Well, we have a $1.04 rate right now. That is our rate in M&O. And there's our 25%. And now this is actual. It'll start as actual. And we were doing pretty well. We were going, when I first got here, we were kind of going down. That's when George had the little bandage. We started working our way in a better angle. But with nothing happened with the legislature, nothing happening with the recapture, no additional funding, and really a slight drop in both our TAV and our enrollment, this is where our projections tell us we're going in the next couple years at 104. That's our direction. And I keep thinking about this as a plane hovering over a runway. I want to stay hovering over the runway. I don't want to go below it. And you cannot continue that forever. This chart, and I won't spend much time on it, shows that we have done some things that have worked well. At one point, it was looking like we would have to take 4 million out. When I first got here, we only took 3. One year we were told, don't take more than 3. We only took 1.6. Last year we said, don't take more than 2. We were trying to smooth that graph out. We only took 900,000. But those factors I have talked about, if you look at how they're going to play out, do not play out well. One number to remember, if this keeps playing out in this way, we drop to 28% in the fund balance. We're going in the wrong direction. And it's not so much the 28% that's bad, it's the curvature going down that is the issue. So when we looked at that, we decided we needed to get really serious and see what options do we have. Okay? And when I'm looking at these things, I know I need all these things in my system, particularly that. Okay? Now, a sappy picture, but this is my mom's class when she taught first grade a long, long time ago. And she drilled into my mind that the most important people in a school district are the kids. And second are the teachers. She would have superintendent way, way, way down here if she could. And I believe that. I do believe that. And when we look about staff and we look about trying to attract and retain high quality staff, this is what the HR professionals, no matter what industry you are in, believe is important. Right? You need to pay people money for them to come to work. These other things are nice too. They really are nice. People want a good environment. They really do want that, but you still need to pay them money. And I just want to talk about that because remember, benefits and salaries are 86% of our budget. So the board a couple years ago said we have to have an objective. We have to have something that we're going to try to do. And so this was the objective. First year teachers, let's tie Lake Travis. Darn it. In football, let's beat them. But on first year teachers, let's tie Lake Travis. Fifth year, we have 12 districts in this area. Let's be in the middle of the pack, somewhere around 6 or 7. Okay? And let our teachers know that if they stick with us, and we want them to stick with us, at years 10, 20, even 30, that they'll be in the top 3. They'll be in the top quartile. It's an objective. It's not a bad objective. You have to have something you aim for. So last year we were able to give a 2% increase. That's the most we felt we could give to staff. And our rankings, we don't know what everyone's going to do at that point, but when we see how everyone did, this is how we fell out. We stayed tied with Lake Travis in 9th. We were about 8th at 5th year teachers, so not quite at our objective, but pretty close to being in the top 3 going on at 10, 20, and I could show you 30 would be the same thing. Now, we have a few factors that are really hurting us this year, and these are the key factors. This is the TAV growth of all the 12 districts we're competing against last year. TAV growth, the growth and value in their community. I know Eanes is 13 billion. Some of these communities are not have as much there, but east of I-35, the percent of value of the homes increased much more this past year than west of I-35. The other piece is some of them are growing pretty well. That helps them in terms of the money that they have coming in. We actually took a dip in enrollment this year that I showed you earlier. The third thing that is difficult for us, look at the recapture rates. We by far have the highest recapture rate. So we have the trifecta of things that can hurt your budget. Okay? So now let's look at what they're doing in terms of salaries. This is what they have decided to do this year with salaries in their districts. Our board has said we will revisit this a little later in the fall. They were hoping the legislature would do something. We haven't made a final decision on our staff, but our staff knows that right now their checks have not changed. Maynard, you might say, you know, if you looked at the last thing, Maynard was kind of in a kind of bad position, and they're giving a 4% raise this year. The reason they're giving a 4% raise is that they have not given a raise since 2014. So they've frozen. They felt they had to do something. So that's why they're that high. So let's say this stands, and we wind up in a situation this year where we do wind up giving 0% increase and don't do anything else. This is where we will find ourselves. We'll be in 10th place at new teachers, 12th at 5th year, 10th at 10 years, and 9th at 20 years. And that is not helping me try to fulfill the attract and retain possibility. Okay? The other thing that's kind of interesting, I'll just be really quick here. Our rank in terms of what we pay in terms of benefits has gone down a little bit. That's because certain districts, particularly I was talking to the superintendent of Del Valley, they were losing people so fast they had to bump the amount that they were doing in benefits significantly in 1 year. They felt they needed to do it to keep retaining people. When you take an increase in the premiums the teachers are paying and the staff is paying for insurance, which was about an 8% increase in what they're paying in health insurance, and then you give them 0% in salary, I want to show you two quick things how that equates. Here's a 5th year's teacher's take-home pay. If they stay on single coverage with high deductible, it's no change in their take-home pay. We do have a good percentage of our staff that's on family coverage. Even if they stay on high deductible, their take-home pay goes down 3%. So it can go somewhere down. A freeze in pay, 0, is really a down for them if they're doing family between 3 and 16% down in 1 year in terms of their pay. If you look at 20, it's not too dissimilar. For family coverage, their pay would go down between 2 and 13%. And that's those are the people I'm facing and trying to figure out a way around this. This is something the board has said they would revisit. We haven't locked in that 0%. Most of these other districts have locked in, other than Hayes, which is trying to make a decision right now. Okay. So George, again, where does he go? What does he look like when he looks at all this? He says, we got to study this and we have to figure out what are our options. Okay? Got to look really carefully and really hard at a lot of things. You know, the bond helped us, well, different groups have helped us. EEF, I told you about that. We do rent fields. We have after school programs that bring in some money. When we get a bond, it helps us pay for certain things so we don't have to pay out of the M&O rate. And the last thing is this thing called golden pennies. In this district, we have 4. The legislature gives you 4 right off the bat. That's why we're at $1.04. It's the 4 that is the golden, okay? And those pennies are not subject to recapture. Out of the 104 pennies, 4 of them are not subject to recapture. So we look at that and we recognize that there are 2 more golden pennies that are an option for the district that are also not subject to recapture. Those are the only 2 more in the law that are allowed. There aren't any more after those 2. Okay? So we looked at that, we studied those golden pennies, and we said, okay, let's look a little bit at the facilities for a second, because that goes back to the last bond. Last bond, 2015, passed by 65% of the voters in the district. That sets an amount of money of debt that you're going to have, but you can only do it for capital improvements, building additions, HVAC, air conditioning, roofs, stuff like that. That's what, it's not to pay for people, okay? And you have a rate that's associated with that. It's called the INS. They try to make this complex, but you have a bond rate. Ours is about 17 cents, or 0.1725 exactly. That's our rate. And it helps us pay off that debt. We pay off that debt in like paying off a mortgage. We take different things for about 20 years is about the length we do, and we pay it off. Try to get the best interest rate and pay it off. And again, you'll see where our rate is in that domain compared to a bunch of other districts around us, okay, the 17 cents. So this is how the total rate comes. You have 104.1725, and you got 1.257 if you just add it together. Remember, I told you, bond dollars are not subject to recapture. For every dollar, you keep a dollar. If your property taxes, because of your assessed evaluation, go up $1, the way the formula is set right now, the district gets a nickel. That's why I'm sending out another $10 million every year, because most of the increase goes to that. The last bond allowed us to get some projects completed. Most happy really about Westridge and Hill Country, our fine arts additions. When you replace windows, it also saves you energy, which does help you on your M&O funds. Roofs actually help you on those types of things. So a lot of those things we're just trying to, and sometimes you're just trying to take care of sprinkler systems and things that just need replacement over time. One of the things that has really been great about our TAV going up to 13 billion is if you take that rate and multiply it, you bring in more money, whether you have 4% growth or you have 8% growth, which is our average, you bring in more money than you need to pay off your debt. The dark purple is your principal. The gray is your interest. And because of that, you can pay off the debt faster and eliminate the debt faster. And boards have been doing that for the last couple of years. In fact, in the last couple of years, since 2013, we have paid off $11.6 million in debt early, saving about $8.3 million in interest payments. So it's actually helped us. Again, we look at it a little closer, and we look at all of these things that we have up there, and I want to look, that's our goal, right? Now, we want to have a balanced budget. We want the lines to flow like this. We know that if we have the rates the way they are right now, and we're at $1.04 in M&O, that is our graph at $1.04. Got it? That's our graph at $1.04. So we started looking at that and thinking, okay, we've got this $1.04 has 100 copper pennies and 4 golden pennies. That's what it is. But the interesting thing about the copper pennies, well, the golden never leave you. Was that a nice little blink? The golden never leave you. You're not subject to recapture. But the copper pennies, in our situation, over 60% are being taken away immediately. That's what recapture is doing for the copper pennies. So we looked at what if, in some way, we got those 2 extra golden pennies. What would that mean in our budget? What it would do is, since it's not subject to recapture, it increases every year the amount of money that we would have coming into our district. And what that also does, and people don't understand this, but it's really kind of interesting. I showed you this graph earlier. This is at $1.04. The percentage of recapture we'll pay out is at 63%. If we go up to $1.06, our percentage of recapture drops under their formula in Texas. So, and I played that out all the way so you can kind of see what happens. It eventually starts getting closer, but we still keep getting approximately $3 million more in revenue every single year. So we looked at this best case and we said, what if, instead of being at $1.04, we were able to move that to $1.06? Right? What if we could do that? What would our graphs look like? And this is what happens to your graph at $1.06. It turns. Now, if you look at it in terms of the projections going out, some of these were the exact same you saw, but at $1.06, this is not 28% anymore, it's 38% in the fund balance. So you've moved the needle in the right direction, okay, in terms of sustainability. So we looked at this in school finance, we're now up to 103, and we said, okay, what if that was $1.06? What if it was? Solves the graph problem, but here's the first problem it creates. If you add this, that's now 123. So you'd raise everyone's rates. Got it? We said that doesn't work. So we said the only way we can do this is let's look at that number, and let's look at that number very carefully and see what options we have. Okay? And the options, we knew at $1.17 we were paying off debt. We said, what happens at 14 cents instead of 17 cents? Do we still pay off debt? And the answer is yes. We actually could still pay off debt under reasonable scenarios, both conservative and average. It still gets paid off. So we still can pay off debt early. Beyond that, people say, well, is it sustainable? Could you still do bonds in the future? So we said, well, what if? Everyone asks me all these questions, and my math mind kicks in, and I start looking at it. I said, okay, let's say we did a bond every 3 to 4 years for a long time. And we wanted the rate to stay at 14 cents, never to go up. How much money could we bring in? And here's what it turns out to. 80 million could be on a bond. Remember, our last bond was at 52.5 million. You actually could go to 80 million at 14 cents. 4 years later, you could go to 170. 4 years later, you could go to another 170. Now, I'm not saying you would do that. What I'm saying is the long-term capacity is there if you need it. So we looked at this, and the thought was, well, what if we take these rates and we kind of play with them a little bit because we don't want to stay at 104. And we say, what if we did 106, 14, and now the whole rate drops to 120. And I'll show you that in another pictorial in a second. But the 106 on the left would turn our graph like that. Okay. And if we did that and we look at, these are our existing rates, so we look to see, okay, which districts have done all the golden pennies? And these three have done all the golden pennies thus far. They're getting all 6. Now you'll see some of them, by the way, are at 108 or 117. That doesn't work for us. We can't really go there because we're a recapture district. 106 is about as high as we would ever want to go. But if we decided to do that, if we changed that 104 to 106, we made that 14, we would go from 121 to 120, and we would recapture approximately $3 million annually. So one of the things that the board is going to allow the community to decide in November is we are going to have one of two rates. We are either going to be at $1.2125 by law, or if the voters vote yes, and I'll tell you what a TRE is in a minute, will be at 120 if they vote yes. But one of those two rates is going to be the fact. That's just the way it is. So I've talked about all of that really kind of works into this. If you do not have a balanced budget, you get into trouble on staffing, you get into trouble on class sizes, you get into trouble on attracting and retaining staff. All of those are all connected, and they're connected with the fiscal responsibility piece. So George looked at all of that, and he said, I'm determined I need to make sure people understand this. So that's the determined George. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. I'm going to give you the short version of what a penny, swap, and drop is. We're probably only the 3rd district in Texas to ever try this. And because we are lucky that our TAV is so high that we can actually do it, and that boards have made some good choices. On this, I want to make sure really clearly, I will not tell you how to vote. That's not my job. My job is to try to bring clarity to the complex and let you make your own decision. Is that okay? Just the facts. So here are the facts. A TRE is something that a tax ratification election, a school board has got to vote to give the community a choice whether to vote yes or no on that. So that's what that is. And whatever happens in that will wind up locking the rate. Okay? Now, one thing to know, a TRE is not a bond. It's not for things. It's not for roofs. It's not for HVAC. It's not for buses. It's for operating the money that goes into salaries and benefits and all those kinds of things in the operating fund. The board unanimously approved the following. They said, let's drop the bond rate by 3.25 cents. They said, let's increase the M&O rate by 2 cents to get the golden pennies. The combined effect will take us from 1.2125 to 1.20, the combined effect of that. And if we did that, because of the 2 extra golden pennies, we would have $3 million more in revenue that would not be subject to recapture. Basically, if the voters vote yes, the tax rate will be 1.2. If the taxpayers vote no, it goes back to what's called the fallback rate, which is our current rate this year, which is 1.2125. Got it? Yes? No. This is the first time I've ever shown the penny swap drop calculator. Okay? So watch very carefully. We'll see if this works. If it doesn't, it's her fault. If it works, it's her fault. No, that's giving you some kudos, okay? But it should work. So let's kind of look at this. So first of all, we have 100 pennies, right? The first 100 pennies. That gives you your first dollar in your M&O rate. Make sense? 100 pennies, first dollar. And that brings in approximately a total of $143.7 million to the district. Got it? In theory. Recapture comes in and takes about 60% of that, and it drops that 143.7 down to 50.2 million that we keep. Make sense? But there are these things called 4 golden pennies. Remember, our rate is not $1. Our rate is $1.04. These little 4 golden pennies alone, which are not subject to recapture, are now bringing in $5.7 million. Almost 10% of what we keep, right? From all those other copper pennies on the left. Now, we also have the bond side. And on the bond side, as I told you, we have a rate of about 17.25, right? And if you add them together, 121.25. Got it? And those are those bond pennies. This tells you what they can pay for. The idea of the swap and drop is to do the following. Swap 2 pennies. Move them over there, right? So now our rate will move from $1 to $1.06, right? But 6 of the pennies will be golden, which will change that number from 5.7 to 8.6 million. You notice it also, when we moved the 2 pennies from the 17, it lowered that to 15, right? But it would be too high a rate, so what the board said is now we're going to drop. And we're going to drop that down to 14 for a total rate of $1.20. That's what swap and drop is about. It basically, if it passes, our tax rate will go lower and we will keep more dollars local. So I always like to talk about this a little bit. First of all, this is what the ballot will look like. This is defined by law They tell us how we have to put the ballot so we don't confuse anyone and we don't try to trick anyone. So this is what the ballot will look like. What is a little difficult is we will be Proposition A. So will Austin ISD. So will Lake Travis ISD. Any ISD doing more than one proposition, one of them is going to be Proposition A. Now, they goofed up a little bit in Austin. They thought it was Proposition 1 when they printed all their signs, but it's Proposition A. This is what the language will look like. You know, if you don't want to confuse people in Texas, the best thing to do is to put things in Latin. That was a joke. I'm not against Latin, but you'll see this in a second. The one thing that could confuse people on the rates is, if you look at that, the first thing it says is a rate 2 cents higher. It's required by law because we are going from 104 to 106. It does say down here, decreasing the overall tax rate by that amount. So the effect of it all happening at once is that you're actually decreasing the tax rate. And then we got the little Latin in there just to make sure everyone brings a Latin dictionary with them to the ballot box, but that's their business. These are the dates that are important connected to that. We have a website. We're also going to do an infomercial that will be out there pretty quickly that will kind of explain all this in about 3 to 4 minutes with little robots. I don't know how they're going to do it that fast, but it'll happen. So that's all I really wanted to say about that. Last thing I want to do is the last part of this presentation, which is really focused on this. This is I wind up having to delve into all this stuff about money and stuff because that's my job. I'm not teaching first grade in a classroom like my mom did. But this is what I think is important. This is what we shared with the staff and the faculty, and I want to show you this again. These kids are all now around in their 70s. Think of the world, how it changed for those kids. In their lifetimes, what changed. And that was kind of the message to the staff. So when we think of these kids, what are they going to experience in their lifetimes? Well, the first thing that's really interesting is let's talk about their lifetimes. Anyone want to guess what the average life expectancy was in 1723? Some of you would not be alive, okay, just so you know. 38.3. That's what it was. X number of years later, it was 41. Before the invention of the cell phone in 1915, okay, it was 48. If you think about that, in about 200 years, it didn't go up that much. 1975, now we get a big jump. In 60 years, it jumps to 74. People say, what the scientists are telling me, this is their work, not my work. They're telling if you're born in 2017, it's going to be about 78. But here's what's really scary. In terms of the advances, the futurists are saying if you are born about 80 years from now, how long do you think you're going to live? They're saying 125. Now, I showed pictures of this. By the way, when you're 125 in that day and age, you're going to look really good. Now, people are amazed when I tell them that I'm 92. I lost the hair, but I'm 92. No. But that has ramifications. Then you think about what's going on with technology, which has really been insane in terms of the acceleration of technology and innovation. You take that and you bring it on the amount of money we're spending in robotics and artificial intelligence, which is going to change our world. It's changing our world now. These kids are going to live longer, and they are going to live through this. I do believe they are going to live through this. Einstein said, automation will make modern industry primitive. Make what we're doing in his time look like the Stone Age. Gates said it a little different. He just said, these things come together, and it's going to be a pretty fantastic world we're going to be living in. It's going to be kind of science fiction. You look at a Tesla plant on the right, and a Ford plant, not a current Ford plant, okay, a Ford plant from the 1940s on the left. Things are changing. The world our kids are going to live in are changing significantly. Companies that no longer exist, you know that class of kids that my mom taught? These are companies that they knew that no longer exist in our world. 40 years ago, these companies didn't exist. That's kind of scary if you think about the companies you're dealing with on a daily basis. The world is changing and changing fast. Job skills. This was from Forbes, and they weren't talking about, going all back to prehistoric age. They were talking about the last, 50, 60 years. But you see that some of the words actually kind of come through. Communication seems to always come through on this line if you look at it. And so when we look at the words just there, and we look at what we call our wheel, what we're expecting our kids to become, the nice thing is all of those words kind of float right into the wheel. So we're on the right track. What we're trying to do with our kids is on the right track. That wheel, if you want to look at all the words, are there. No matter whether you're dealing with Alexa, a robot, or your car, you better be a good, effective communicator or you're going to be in trouble. Also with your spouse. Okay? It doesn't hurt to be good at communication. It really doesn't. I was a math major. I do this much math, this much communication. That's my life. Okay? The other things there, I think most people, who wants their kid not to be healthy, well-rounded? Those are good things no matter what these kids wind up going through. These are the things that we've been working on for the last year. The board, I thought, was wise, and they said, we're working on the same stuff. We're not going to change what we're working on every single year. In the classroom, you heard Leslie talk about it earlier, we are focused on SEL, and I'll talk about what that is a little bit, and communication, with using the proper amount of technology, which means sometimes turning the technology off, which is okay. You don't need technology for everything, but you do need to understand how to use it when you need to use it. So these kids, social emotional learning, these are the competencies, no matter what program we're using, that we're trying to make sure are instilled in them. No matter what the world looks like, they will need resiliency. They will need grit, and they will need empathy and compassion, particularly now. That's the world we live in. I don't know what it's going to be like in 100 years. I'm not going to be here, thankfully. Darwin. Being able to adapt is more important than anything else. Angela Duckworth, if you haven't seen her TED Talk, see it on kids. If you're a parent, it's a good TED Talk to see. Grit is extremely important for kids. This is what we're working on. We are also in the communication domain. The only twist we've thrown into it this year is we want kids to read and write in every core subject every day. Reading and writing are important. No matter what the world becomes, they'll still be important. I do believe that. You can't write a persuasive or informative article without having critical thinking skills in terms of how you're putting it together. You need that. So we try to keep it simple. We have gone into language immersion. We have 80 kindergartners for the first time in the district right now in Spanish immersion. We've done that. We had 6 companies that were funded last year at Westlake High School by outside investors in the business incubator, and we're working on a potential culinary program to start in the next year or 2. Things we're just looking at for the future. That's it. I'm done. Question or 2. And I know that was way too long, but there's a lot there.